Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Mike Briggs looks at profit margins in the feedlot industry. Greg Ibach reminds farmers to be safe during harvest. Tamra Jackson-Ziems explains why cornfields with stalk rot should be prioritized for harvesting. And John Wilson describes how soybean cyst nematodes take millions of dollars from soybean farmers each year. Mike Briggs is our cattle market analyst this week. Data released Wednesday shows beef prices soared to new highs in August. Lean and extra lean ground beef rose to $5.62 per pound, a jump of 22 cents from July. More drastic, the cost of all fresh retail beef increased nearly 26 cents to $5.81 per pound. As you've heard in our episodes this summer, Nebraska's cattle, which account for about a quarter of the state's soybean meal, are at historically high levels of value. The drought that destroyed that industry's feed source is now over. This week's U.S. Drought Monitor from UNL shows only 8% of Nebraska is listed as abnormally dry, the lowest percentage since August 30th, 2011. We talked with Mike Wednesday morning and first asked him to give us an overview of what the markets have been like.
Market's been really volatile, pretty sloppy. You've got the dollar rallying, you've got other things going on that are kind of hindering our exports a little bit. Then you've had maybe a little uptick in supply of fat cattle, and it's been really volatile on a week-by-week basis as whatever's available in front of that packer. So it's been kind of interesting as of late.
More or less, though, this is still a supply issue?
It absolutely is a supply issue, and it will continue to be, and probably become more of an issue as we go through time because they're can't make cattle that fast.
Can you still see that chart climb maybe a little bit farther here as we go into 2015?
I think so, because I think we're going to be really short cattle fourth quarter and first quarter of next year, because every single month since May you've had a serious reduction in placements compared to history, and that's going to show up. And it's going to show up in the fourth and the first quarter of next year, I think. Rather than asking where the ceiling is, where's the bottom at here? Where's the floor at in this market? I can't see how beef can go under, or live cattle can go under 140. That's a pretty big fall from here, but I think 140, 145 probably stops at top side. I don't know how much is the consumer willing to pay. I'm pretty sure we'll make a run at $170 cash. We might even try a little higher than that before it's over. Just kind of depends.
How much is the feed yard willing to pay to stock these animals?
That's the thing that's going to take all the fun out of it. We're going to run all the margin out of these feeder cattle because people have made money. There's a lot of money behind them. There's always that constant pressure to stay full. And my concern is we run all the margin out of the feeder cattle, the price will be high and you still won't make any money.
All right, slaughter numbers, could they increase as we enter fall at all?
I think we've seen a little uptick here, and we might see it stay up here for, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks. But I think as we get towards the end of October, into November, November's always a tough month. I think supplies are really going to fall off, and it's really going to be interesting. plus, as we've talked before, beef has become kind of a Christmas meat, and you always see middle meats get really high and really hard to come by in that December timeframe, anytime after Thanksgiving. I think this year could get really interesting.
What about weights? Where have they been and where could they go as we see temperatures cool off?
That's a great question. Weights have been going up astronomically. I've seen some of the biggest, we've shipped some of the biggest cattle we've ever shipped out of this feed yard. And it's just it's a simple function of math and good weather. Our cost of gains are down. We're getting a lot of money for these cattle when we sell them. You just keep putting it on. As long as that spread's there, you just keep putting it on. And we're seeing these cattle get to 15, 16, 1,700 pounds almost on a regular basis.
Now, there isn't a point where that gets too sloppy?
When your customer, the packer, says, I don't want those anymore, right now they're just taking anything you got. You know, there was a time where those big cattle, they would dock you pretty hard, but that's pretty much gone by the wayside. All
right, input costs, describe where they are right now.
Lower, and I think going to continue to be that way. We're going to have this gargantuan corn crop. You've seen two new ethanol plants come online, well, not new ethanol plants, but 2 ethanol plants in Aurora come online. So you're going to have a good supply of byproduct, at least in the eastern half of the state, and you're going to have corn everywhere. So I think your feed costs are going to be in really good shape. The thing that's interesting to me is your alfalfa. So much alfalfa's been ripped up. Your alfalfa hay price seems to have a pretty good floor under it, but you know, you can get pretty cheap corn silage now.
Have you bought corn into the future, or are you still just going as you need it?
I'm going hand to mouth. You're seeing a situation where this harvest is delayed, and the farmer, who's pretty well heeled, doesn't want to sell at these prices because it's not profitable for him. So you've seen a really tight and a really out of line basis to the positive side. So to buy a bunch of that, I don't want any part of it, because I still contend once harvest starts, this market's got nowhere to go but down.
You mentioned the strength of the dollar. How do you think that's affecting the overseas buyers?
Oh, I think it's affecting them dramatically. It's affecting them in 2 ways. The buyers aren't buying very much, and we're importing a lot more beef from like Australia, which we need more lean, and that's fine, but so we're getting a lot of lean beef in as an import. I think on an export deal, that's going to be a problem as we go forward, because that's a real challenge for some countries.
Cattle on Feed report will be Friday. You know, Nebraska and Texas have kind of been battling for that top spot, but as a state, do you feel like Nebraska's positioned really well here with the size of this corn crop going forward?
There's no question. There's a lot of issues there. There's just a plain water issue in Texas. There's feed yards in areas of Texas running out of the water because they've sucked the old Galala aquifer dry in their area. We've got water, we've got corn, we've got packing plants. It's all shifting back this way, and I think Nebraska, Iowa are in very good position to capitalize on that.
Next week, we'll look at corn and soybean markets with Roy Smith. Dow AgroSciences said this week it received USDA approval for its Enlist corn and soybean traits in the U.S. Dow says it'll now wait for the EPA registration of the Enlist Duo herbicide. Used with the traits, Enlist Duo is aimed at weeds with resistance to herbicides, including 2,4-D. We've discussed possible use of Enlist Duo previously on Market Journal. An interview with Greg Kruger on the topic can be found in our August 29th episode. While harvest has begun in other states within the country, most of Nebraska's crops remain in the field. Once it does start, though, the harvest brings with it associated risks of large equipment and fast-moving parts. As combines will soon start moving, we asked Nebraska Department of Ag Director Greg Ibach to share some quick safety reminders.
We're looking at maybe a later harvest than what we're used to, and so when producers do finally have those crops that reach dry down and they get busy, I'm sure they'll be in a hurry. So I think we want producers to remember that safety comes first, and that they need to think about having important things around, including fire extinguishers and things like that in their combine, because we want a safe harvest as well as a productive harvest. Harvest time always is a time when you know, you're hurrying around the equipment, and you want to make sure you have your loose clothing kind of close to you, and maybe wear tighter clothing around, especially PTOs. You know, it seems like every year we hear about somebody who loses fingers or something in an auger, and so you also need to be careful when you're you know, unloading those grain trucks. Hopefully most of the farmers have cleaned out their bins and are ready for harvest, but if there is some corn left over from last year, We want to make sure that that corn hasn't bridged or done something that could present a dangerous situation. So take extra care to make sure you are being careful and taking care of yourself.
The USDA's weekly crop progress report shows the state hasn't started its corn harvest. When it does, though, UNL Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems says farmers might need to prioritize fields due to injury from stalk rot. Stalk rot could not only be a problem for this year's corn growers, but also those rotating to soybeans in the next planting season. Ears on the ground now could lead to volunteer corn that, as you heard earlier this summer, could drag soybean yield 10 to 30% if heavy infestations are allowed to compete early in the season. We talked with Tamra Wednesday afternoon near West Point about the prevalence of stalk rot in the state.
We're seeing some stalk rot development all the way across the state right now, and we're still pretty early in the process.
Why is it so prevalent?
Well, this year we've of course had a lot of stress all the way across the state, and we've had a lot of leaf area loss due to several different diseases like northern corn leaf blight and Goss's wilt, a lot of hail and wind damage, you name it. And so those plants are extra stressed and cannibalizing their stalks more than normal.
Sort of pick your poison type of thing that led to it, huh?
Absolutely.
Is it a different type of stalk rot? Are we seeing all kinds of it? What is it?
Well, we're seeing a diversity of different stalk rots, and the end result is the same. And so weakened stalks, and you have the potential for lodging out there.
And why is that important now as we get close to harvest?
Well, I especially want to encourage people to get out and make sure you know what the threat is in your field. And if you start to see plants turning colors and turning brown a little early, or patches turning before the rest of the field, I would especially target those and use that push or pinch test to evaluate if those plants are going to snap back up or go ahead and lodge over, and split them open, and you can confirm it on the inside too.
Self-diagnosis is okay in this case?
Absolutely. If those stalks are squishy and kind of starting to hollow out, by all means this is an issue and could be a potential risk for lodging.
What does that mean for these affected fields or areas around harvest time as you bring the combine out?
Well, as people begin to identify problem areas or fields that have a particular problem, I would recommend harvesting those first or even earlier, because the cost of trying to harvest lodge corn later on if we have wind events could exceed the cost that you may have for trying to dry some of that corn.
Let's talk about how this could affect soybeans. There's one type of stalk rot that can also be found in soybeans?
And that's right, and there are not many diseases that go to more than one crop, but there is one stalk rot disease, and that's charcoal rot. And so fields that are not irrigated and have had some drought stress here and there throughout the season, maybe on hilltops, maybe ones that you want to watch as well in soybean and also alfalfa or sorghum.
How much yield could be on the ground there that would cause volunteer corn the next year?
Well, that's certainly something to think about, and so we don't want to lose anything at harvest, especially with crop prices as low as they are. But also volunteer corn can be a reservoir for inoculum of different fungi or bacteria for the next corn crop to come, so we have to control the volunteer corn as well.
What management options are available for this, Tamra?
Well, for stalk rots, there's nothing we can do right now. Stalk rots in general tend to come after we've had stresses during the season, and we do everything we can already to minimize that stress. And so in general, if you can monitor your populations, try not to make those too high and try not to over-fertilize and water at optimal times. There's not much otherwise you can do except maybe hybrid selection when we have just a few options for more resistant hybrids.
Should also mention while we're here that portions of the state, including this area, saw some frost damage. What can that do to the corn?
Well, if the frost was severe enough that it causes premature plant death before black layer, this could potentially lead to some ear rot problems. And of course, that would further compound what we're looking at now. And having ear rot problems, especially things like cladosporium, like we had in 2009, we know cause not only harvest problems, but also storage problems that we want to try to avoid. So I would monitor for those as well.
Related to frost damage, the Crop Watch website has information on how frost or freeze can damage corn and soybean plants. We'll link to that article on the Market Journal website. For decades, the Central Nebraska Public Power and Irrigation District has delivered surface water to customers in Gosper, Phelps, and Kearney counties through ditches and gated pipe. That began to change about 30 years ago as center pivots were added to pull water from system canals. In the September Nebraska Farmer, you can read about this move to water use efficiency. As of this year, 531 center pivots irrigate crops using Central District water, Pivots now account for 60,000 of the district's 110,000 acres. Bertrand irrigator Phil High says pivots mean more uniform water application, less water applied, and less labor. High has 8 pivots on the system. You can read about the benefits to the Central District and its irrigators in the September Nebraska Farmer. There is one problem in soybeans that costs Nebraska growers more than all other diseases combined: Soybean Cyst Nematode. As you'll hear in a minute, SCN has now been found in more than half of the state's counties. In 2013, Nebraska farmers submitted over 1,000 soil samples to UNL. 2 of the 5 highest SCN egg counts came from Rock County, with the other 3 coming from Knox, Antelope, and Cumming. UNL Extension educator John Wilson joined us near Tekamah Wednesday to discuss sampling and managing this expensive problem.
Well, we've identified it in 56 counties now, basically the eastern half to 2/3 of the state. Furthest west we found it has been out around McCook. Last year we estimated the losses from soybean cyst nematode to soybean growers in the state to be about $45 million. This year the losses are going to be less, which is kind of good news, except the reason isn't because SCN is becoming less common, it's because the price of the commodity is down. So that makes it even more important to find out if you have SCN in your field and manage it, because the bushels it might be taking become even more crucial.
Why is it so damaging to the plant?
That it attacks the root system, it competes with the plant for moisture and nutrients. It isn't something that's easy to see. Like this field right here, we've been in fields that looked this good or better and had 20 to 30% yield loss when we looked at resistant compared to susceptible varieties.
Is that all in one year, or can the yield slowly go down over time?
Usually that's the first sign that people will see that to know that they have a problem. SCN doesn't cause any distinct symptoms on the plant, and quite often when soybean yields in the field level off or might even start to drop, but yet corn yields or whatever other commodity they might have in there, yields tend to or keep increasing, that's a pretty good sign that you need to be checking for SCN.
What other problems can be associated with this, like sudden death syndrome?
That where the soybean cyst nematode will attack the roots, it opens up areas on the root that some of these other diseases, such as sudden death syndrome or brown stem rot, can enter the plant. Now we can have a field with SCN that has no sudden death syndrome. We can have a field that has sudden death syndrome and no SCN. But if we have SCN in a field or part of a field, that field or part of the field will be more likely to have SDS, or it will be more severe in those areas where SCN is present.
Why is now a good time to sample?
Well, we're just moving into harvest. You can see the beans are turning here. That usually after harvest is probably one of the slower times of the year. Folks have a little more time to do that. They're frequently taking samples for their fertilizer recommendations for the following year anyway. So a lot of times what I'll recommend is they just take a few more cores, mix up the samples, split it, send half in for fertility, half in for SCN analysis. One other reason is that right after harvest, those poor yielding spots in your field are still fresh in your mind. We had the west end of the field that didn't yield as well, and it's not a different soil type. It didn't have herbicide injury or any other factor that might reduce yields. When we have things like that, or looking at our yield maps, we can kind of identify those areas where we might want to be checking for SCN in a field.
Because it can be so spotty, how do you make sure that you get a representative sample and are able to find it?
What we want to do is, first off, if we have a field and we don't have any reason to suspect that it's there, we just want to make sure that we do a good job of collecting samples throughout the field, kind of make a zigzag pattern back and forth across the field, take a minimum 15 to 25 cores, mix them all together so we hit those all areas of the field. After harvest, if we're in a soybean field, it's real easy to go along, and if we have the old, where the old soybean row is, just sample off to the side of it, so we're sure that we're probing down through the root system. Since it does attack the roots, we're more likely to pick it up in those areas too. Also, there are places in a field where we more commonly see it. Anything that will move soil around can also move SCN around. And so low areas in a field, parts of a field that might be flooded if it's along a creek, right near a field entryway. If we had SCN in another field, we brought in a piece of tillage or harvest equipment. When we came into the field, dirt that might be clinging to that equipment might drop off there, so frequently we'll see it right by the field entryways as well. So we want to be sure and collect those samples from those areas, as well as just general samples across the field.
And maybe more importantly, if you find out you do have soybean cyst nematode, what should you do?
That once we know we have it in the field, we're never going to get rid of it. We can't rotate out by not planting soybeans for 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It can remain dormant in the soil for that long. So what we want to do is, if we weren't following a rotation pattern, if we'd been going continuous soybeans, we'd like to rotate with at least 1 year of a non-host crop, which is just about anything else we grow in Nebraska. And then in the years when we do plant soybeans, using a resistant variety. One of the nice things about resistant soybean varieties is there's not a tech fee associated with them like there are for certain other traits. So it doesn't cost any more to plant SCN resistant varieties than it would a conventional variety.
And UNL data shows that works?
Yes, over the past 8 years, we've had 29 sites where we had replicated plots out comparing resistant and susceptible soybeans in SCN-infested fields. And over those 29 sites in 8 years, that we've had average yield increase of about 6 bushels per acre where we planted resistant soybeans against some of our top-yielding varieties. What's interesting about that is we also planted the same varieties, susceptible and resistant, in non-infested sites, and over that same time period, we only had about a 2 bushel yield advantage to the susceptible varieties, which shows that our resistant varieties are on the same level yield potential with our top-yielding susceptible varieties.
Since 2005, the Nebraska Soybean Board has provided soybean cyst nematode sample bags at no cost to the farmer. Those bags can be picked up at your local UNL Extension office. Now, with his weekly weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. Of course, the big news during this last 7 days was the freezing temperatures that invaded the state during this past weekend. Honestly, did not believe that we would see the temperatures as cold as what happened. It is what it is. We do have a fairly extensive report, at least in terms of the temperatures for stations that we were able to get data on. That does appear at cropwatch.unl.edu, and you can link on that to see where the low temperatures bottom out at individual sites that we're reporting. Secondarily, we did not receive much in the way of significant moisture this week. Most of the activity occurred with the frontal boundary patch that started to invade the state over this last 24-hour period, and started to generate some scattered and isolated thunderstorm activity in the northern part of the state, and that's expected to move completely through the state as we progress through today. So let's take a look at the upper air models for today and what we might expect during this next week. And the first thing I'll draw your attention to is we have another trough that's trying to bring some polar air over to the Great Lakes region. That has been responsible for dragging a cold front through our region. Now that is expected to clear the state as we regress to this morning, and therefore we would expect most of the thunderstorm activity that still resides across the state to dissipate. There is an outside possibility that we'll see some reformation of that thunderstorm activity during the afternoon, but it'll probably be confined more to east central and southeast Nebraska. The remainder of the state will be dry. Now as we go into tomorrow, we will see that a piece of energy coming off a cutoff upper level low will be starting to translate its way into the central basin, Great Basin region, and eventually it's going to make its way out into the central plains. So we are going to see nice ridging building up behind this exiting trough. So a little bit cooler conditions for Sunday than compared to today. And then we will start to see the possibility of some isolated thunderstorm activity developing in the extreme western high plains region as we get into tomorrow night. By Monday, we'll start to see this system coming into the western South Dakota, so there is expectation that we will generate some late afternoon thunderstorm activity scattered in nature across the panhandle, and some of that will begin to shift eastward as we get through the overnight hours. And by Tuesday, this system is now making its way into the central Dakotas, and so this looks to be an opportunity for thunderstorm activity to develop across a broad portion of the state of Nebraska. Although it's not going to be significant, there will be enough to cause a little bit of wetness issues across portions of the state. Best likelihood for significant moisture is probably going to be across the western half of the state. Now on Wednesday, this system starts to dissipate, but it will bring the chance for isolated thunderstorm activity to eastern Nebraska. And as we get into Thursday, we start to see a rather significant trough building in the western United States. That's going to start to pump up the warmer area into our region and bring us fairly nice conditions. And that should hold through Friday before the system starts to make its way into our region. And this looks like it could develop some fairly significant moisture with it. We'll wait to see whether or not this verifies as we do next week's forecast. So as we look at the temperature forecast for this week, fairly seasonal temperatures, slightly above normal across the east, probably running 2 to 5 degrees above normal. In the west, we're going to run about 5 to 7 degrees above normal. Temperatures going from the low to mid 70s during the weekend, possibly moving up into the upper 70s across eastern Nebraska as we get late into next week. And for temperatures across the western part of the state, we'll be looking primarily at the low to mid 80s, with possibility as we get toward the end of next week to approach the 90-degree mark. Now as we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast, we're looking for the above normal temperatures to continue, but remember our highs at this time of the year are generally in the lower 70s. And in terms of precipitation, most of the major precipitation stays to our north. Now as we look at the forecast for the month of October, we do see a tongue of cooler air being depicted by CPC coming up into the central Rocky Mountain Basin, some of that touching into southwestern Nebraska, above normal to our east and to our west. In terms of precipitation, 2 slugs of precipitation, the southwest and the northern plains. This will be associated with the northern jet. This is our subtropical plume that we've been dealing with these recent hurricanes. And in terms of our fall forecast, October through December, above normal temperatures to our north, below normal to our south. In terms of precipitation, we start to see the impacts of El Nino coming into the forecast.
Thanks, Al. Today's information on cattle markets, harvest safety, corn stalk rot, and soybean cyst nematode can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. Additionally, you can follow Market Journal throughout the week on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next week, Roy Smith will be our corn and soybean market analyst. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.